Europe, 1945. The thunder of artillery had faded into silence. The war was dying, but the pain was not. On the outskirts of a small German village near the Rhine, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks rolled through the muddy road. Their destination, a makeshift American field hospital built inside a former school. Inside one of the trucks sat 5 German women, nurses of the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. Their gray uniforms still bore the faded insignia of a crumbling empire. They weren't soldiers, yet they had lived through the same fire. They were captured 2 days earlier when an American patrol stumbled upon a collapsing German aid station. No resistance, no gunfire, just exhaustion and quiet surrender. The eldest of them, Frau Richter, had worked in military hospitals since 1939. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. Next to her, Greta, barely 20, clutched a medical satchel as if it were a shield. They expected interrogation, maybe even punishment. The stories spread through German ranks were clear. The Americans take no mercy on enemy nurses. But when the truck stopped, what they saw shattered every expectation. Rows of white tents, organized chaos, American medics running between stations, portable generators humming, sterile instruments gleaming under bright surgical lights. It didn't look like a battlefield, it looked like a miracle. An American officer approached, Captain Howard, a surgeon from Chicago. He looked at them, tired but composed. "You're safe here," he said, his accent strange to their ears. "We have wounded, so do you. Let's keep people alive." The nurses exchanged glances. Was this a trick? Then came the smell. Antiseptic, alcohol, clean gauze, not the stench of infection they'd grown used to in German bunkers. Everywhere they looked, order replaced despair. Wounded soldiers, German and American alike, lay side by side. No distinction, no hate, only medicine. A young German soldier moaned softly. An American medic kneeled beside him, checking vitals, adjusting his bandage. The nurses froze, watching. The medic didn't speak German, but kindness doesn't need translation. Later that night, when the Americans offered them food, the women hesitated. "Eat," said an African-American orderly, placing 10 trays before them. "War's over for you now." The youngest, Greta, whispered, "They feed prisoners?" No one answered, but for the first time in months, she ate without fear. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant explosions, echoes of a war that refused to die quietly. But inside that tent, something extraordinary was happening. Enemies were healing each other. And the captured nurses were beginning to realize the Americans were not just winning the war with weapons, they were winning it with science and compassion. Inside the miracle hospital, morning came cold and gray over the American camp. The smell of coffee and disinfectant mingled with the damp air. Outside, soldiers lined up for breakfast. Inside the hospital tent, the war's aftermath lay in rows of cots and silent breathing. The captured nurses awoke in a separate tent, given blankets, bread, and tea. They hadn't slept that peacefully in years. When Captain Howard entered, they rose instinctively. He motioned for them to relax. He said, "We could use your help.
and held out a clipboard. "For wounded Germans, your people." There was hesitation. They were prisoners, yet the tone was not commanding, it was cooperative. For the first time they felt needed, not condemned. One by one they followed him into the main ward. The sound hit them first. Rhythmic footsteps, quick orders, soft groans, clinking instruments. The hospital moved like a living organism, precise, efficient, relentless. An American nurse handed Frau Richter a surgical mask. She'd never seen one made of gauze so fine, fitted perfectly over the mouth and nose. The U.S. Army had standardized infection control, something still foreign to many German field units. At the far end, two medics wheeled in a soldier on a stretcher. His chest was soaked with blood. A doctor shouted for plasma, O positive. Within seconds, a bag was ready. Not a glass bottle, but a flexible pouch connected by a clean rubber tube. The German nurses froze, staring. In their hospitals, transfusions were a gamble. Blood stored too long could kill as easily as it could save. But here, it flowed smoothly, controlled, monitored, documented. Howard noticed their confusion. "Dehydration, shock. We replace volume before blood loss takes them," he explained simply. Greta swallowed hard. "You replace it with plasma." He nodded. "From donors across the ocean." They exchanged glances. Across the ocean. Somewhere in America, civilians had given part of themselves for strangers fighting half a world away. In the corner, another nurse prepared an X-ray plate. The machine hummed softly. A mobile X-ray unit, compact and reliable. Frau Richter had only seen one in Berlin before the bombings. Here it was, working in a tent in the middle of nowhere.
The image appeared in minutes, clear as day. A bullet lodged near the ribs. The surgeon made his decision immediately. No guesswork, no waiting. In Germany, such precision required luck and equipment that rarely survived the air raids. Here, the Americans carried medicine with them, like ammunition. Hours passed. The German nurses began to assist, sterilizing instruments, checking vitals, dressing wounds. No one shouted at them, no one called them the enemy. They were simply nurses again. During a short break, Greta sat outside, watching a group of American medics unload supplies. Wooden crates marked U.S. Army Medical Department, syringes, sulfur powder, morphine, bandages, a logistic miracle feeding the front lines. She whispered to herself, "They have more medicine than we had soldiers." Frau Richter joined her. "This is how they win," she said quietly, "not just with bombs, but with this." Later that night, a storm hit the valley. Rain hammered the tents, but operations continued uninterrupted. Electric lights flickered, powered by portable generators, another invention the nurses had never seen used on the battlefield. In a lull between surgeries, an American nurse offered them coffee. Her name was Clara, a woman from Boston, her uniform marked with the Red Cross. She spoke slowly, patiently, bridging the language gap with gestures and smiles. She said, "You help, we thank," placing her hand on her chest. The gesture felt heavier than words. That night, as the German nurses lay awake, they realized they'd crossed an invisible border, not of geography, but of belief. They had been taught that their nation's medicine was unmatched,
their science superior, their cause righteous. Yet here, in a muddy tent built by the enemy, they saw something truer, a system built not on fear, but on care. War was supposed to divide humanity, but in that hospital, it revealed how deeply the same heart beats in everyone.
Dark, thoughtful, factual, and emotionally weighty, like Secrets of War or BBC Cold War Files. The shock of compassion. By the third day, the captured nurses had stopped counting hours. Inside the field hospital, time was no longer measured by days, but by heartbeats saved. Rain turned the roads into rivers of mud, yet wounded soldiers kept arriving. Americans, Germans, even civilians caught in the crossfire. Each stretcher carried a story of pain, and each was met with the same hands, calm, determined, impartial. Greta was dressing a wound on a young American's arm when she noticed something strange. The cot next to him held a German prisoner. The same doctor moved between them without hesitation, checking pulses, changing dressings, whispering reassurance in 2 different languages. She froze. In the Reich's hospitals, enemy soldiers were treated separately, often last, sometimes never. Here, there was no enemy, only patience. Frau Richter stood near the operating tent, assisting Clara, the American Red Cross nurse. A German paratrooper was bleeding from a leg wound, an injury that, back home, might have meant amputation. But the Americans fought for every limb, every drop of life. Clara cleaned the wound, injected penicillin, and smiled gently. "Lucky," she said, tapping the syringe. "This saves lives. No gangrene." Penicillin, the miracle drug. In Germany, they had heard rumors of it, an experimental medicine the Allies guarded closely. Now, Frau Richter watched it flow into the veins of a German soldier. Her throat tightened. "Even for him?" she asked quietly. Clara looked puzzled, then understood. She nodded, "Yes, for anyone who bleeds." That moment cut deeper than any wound. Word spread quickly among the German nurses. The Americans had enough medicine for everyone. Antibiotics, plasma, clean instruments, used without hesitation, without prejudice. Greta watched an American medic kneel beside a German boy no older than 16. The boy whispered, "Ich will nach Hause," "I want to go home." The medic didn't understand the words, but he covered his hand with his own and said softly, "You will, kid. Just hang in there."
The nurses exchanged glances. This wasn't propaganda. This was humanity, raw and unfiltered. Later that afternoon, Captain Howard called them together. He spoke calmly, his tone professional. "We've received orders to evacuate the critical cases to the rear. We'll need your help with the transport." Frau Richter nodded immediately. Helping the wounded, that, at least, was something they understood. When the convoy departed, Greta rode in the back of an ambulance with 2 American medics and a mix of wounded, both sides lying shoulder to shoulder. No flags, no ranks, just the sound of the engine and labored breathing. One German soldier, pale and weak, looked at her and whispered, "They treat us like their own." She nodded, unable to reply. The road to the rear base wound through shattered villages, burned homes, broken tanks, the skeletons of trees. Everything spoke of destruction. Yet inside that ambulance there was only life. Hours later, when they reached a larger evacuation hospital, the German nurses were speechless. Rows of barracks converted into wards, each equipped with electric lights, sterilizers, running water. Dozens of nurses, American, British, Canadian, moving like a coordinated machine. Greta whispered, "It's like a city made of medicine." Frau Richter stared at the flag outside, the red cross on white. "Maybe this is what civilization looks like," she murmured. That night, the German nurses sat together under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Silence hung heavy between them. They had spent years tending to the broken and freezing bunkers, surrounded by shortages and fear. They had believed their homeland's propaganda, that the Reich's science and medicine were unmatched, that Germany led the world in innovation. But now they saw a different truth, one built not on pride, but progress. In the darkness, Greta spoke softly. Maybe we were fighting the wrong kind of war." No one answered. They didn't need to. Outside, the sound of distant aircraft rumbled across the sky, reminders that the war was still alive somewhere beyond the hills. But inside those tents, the battle had shifted, not for territory or glory, but for humanity itself. And for the captured nurses, the enemy was no longer the one in front of them, it was everything they had once believed.
The days blurred into a rhythm of healing. For the German nurses, captivity had turned into purpose. They were no longer prisoners of war. They had become witnesses to something larger than victory or defeat. At dawn, the hospital came alive like clockwork. Engines rumbled, instruments clinked, voices murmured through the mist. Every movement carried precision, a kind of discipline they had never seen in the chaos of collapsing German medicine. Frau Richter stood beside an American anesthetist during an operation. A soldier lay on the table, a bullet lodged deep in his abdomen. The surgeon, Captain Howard, worked calmly, every motion deliberate. An assistant adjusted a portable anesthesia machine, its gauges hissing softly. The nurse controlling the ether drip read vitals on a clipboard, blood pressure, pulse, oxygen levels, recorded meticulously. In Germany, such organization had vanished with the bombings of the cities. Hospitals were fragmented, running on candlelight and hope. Here in a tent, the Americans recreated the efficiency of a city hospital. Frau Richter whispered, "They have a machine for everything." Clara smiled through her mask. For every problem, there is a solution, if you prepare before the war. After the operation, the German nurses helped clean the table, soaking instruments in antiseptic, sterilizing them for reuse. Every detail mattered, every rule enforced. It wasn't arrogance, it was respect for life. Greta, working beside a young American orderly named James, noticed how every wounded man was logged by name, unit, and medical condition. Even German prisoners received their own medical charts. "Why do you keep records for them?" she asked. James shrugged. "Because they're patients, not ghosts." The simplicity of that answer left her speechless. Later that afternoon, a Red Cross truck arrived from the rear lines carrying new supplies. Boxes of morphine, sulfa drugs, sterile bandages, even chocolate and cigarettes for patients. To Greta, it felt unreal, like a factory of mercy. Meanwhile, news spread through the hospital. The war was nearing its end. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. Rumors whispered that Hitler was hiding in Berlin. But inside the tents, war politics didn't matter. What mattered was whether the next soldier on the table would live. As evening fell, the nurses gathered in the recovery ward. Rows of men slept beneath wool blankets, German and American side by side.
One moaned softly, dreaming of home. Another asked for water in broken English. Greta gently wiped the forehead of a wounded German pilot. When she turned, she saw Captain Howard treating an American private with the same tenderness. Different uniforms, same fragility. That night, the nurses sat outside under a fading red sunset. For the first time, they spoke freely. Frau Richter said, "We were taught that compassion was weakness, but here, it's strength." Greta nodded. They treat life like it has no side.
She looked at her hands, hands that once worked in bomb shelters, soaked in blood and fear. Now they worked in light. The oldest nurse, Ingrid, who had barely spoken since their capture, finally whispered, "Maybe they didn't just win because of power, but because they remembered what they were fighting for." The others fell silent. In the distance, the hum of generators filled the air, steady, reliable, endless. The same machines that powered lights for surgeries, heat for tents, and hope for men who should have died. Greta gazed toward the main tent, glowing softly against the night. To her it looked like a cathedral, not of religion, but of reason and mercy. She whispered, "We built hospitals to serve the state. They built them to save the soul." The words hung in the cold night air, heavier than any sermon. And as they drifted to sleep, a quiet realization settled in their hearts. The true difference between defeat and victory was not who held the gun, but who held the bandage.
The lesson of mercy. The war was nearly over, but for the nurses, the hardest lesson was yet to come. It began one gray morning, when the wind carried an unfamiliar smell. Smoke, not from battle, but from something older, deeper. Moments later, a jeep arrived at the hospital, its tires thick with mud. Two medics jumped down, their faces pale. "Evacuees coming from the east. Civilians, bad condition," one said. The German nurses watched as trucks pulled in, filled with frail figures wrapped in torn blankets. Their faces hollow, their eyes lifeless. They weren't soldiers, they weren't prisoners of war. They were survivors. Word spread through the camp. They had come from a nearby concentration camp the Americans had liberated days earlier. Men, women, even children. Starved, diseased, barely human to the eyes of those who had forgotten what mercy looked like. The American doctors moved instantly, ordering food, disinfectant, cots, warm water. But they needed more hands, and the German nurses were called in. Greta froze at the tent's entrance. The sight before her shattered every illusion she had ever held. Bodies trembling with fever, eyes that had seen too much pain to still believe in the world. Tattooed numbers on forearms. She had heard rumors, of course, whispers dismissed as enemy propaganda. But here it was, real, unavoidable. Captain Howard handed her a tray of medical supplies. "Help us clean their wounds," he said simply. No judgment, no accusation, just work to be done. Her hands trembled. She wanted to refuse, to run, to hide behind ignorance. But something in his calm steadiness held her there.
Inside the recovery tent, Clara read aloud to the survivors. Soft words in English, stories of peace and home. The nurses listened from the doorway. The war that once seemed so righteous now felt hollow, like a lie told too many times. Frau Richter whispered to herself, "All our science, all our pride, and we built this." Greta answered quietly, "And they build hospitals." Outside, the storm finally broke. Lightning flickered across the dark horizon, illuminating rows of tents, shelters of mercy in a world still learning how to be human again. For the first time, the German nurses no longer saw themselves as prisoners. They were witnesses, not to American power, but to its purpose. To use knowledge not as a weapon, but as a promise.
One evening, she met a wounded American officer passing through. He had been part of the same medical unit that once held her captive. When he recognized her, he smiled. "You made it home," he said. Greta nodded. "Yes, and I think I found something to fight for." He asked, "What's that?" She looked around at the patients, children, widows, the broken and forgotten. "For this," she said simply, "for life itself." Years later, when Germany began to rebuild, the story of those captured German nurses faded into the quiet corners of history. No medals, no records, just memories of a time when compassion crossed enemy lines. Frau Richter became an instructor at a small nursing school, teaching not from textbooks, but from experience. She told her students, "Medicine is not for nations, it is for people." Ingrid lived out her days in silence, tending to the elderly in a ruined town that slowly healed. She never forgot the smell of antiseptic in that American tent, or the faces of the men who taught her what mercy meant. And Greta, she continued nursing until old age. Sometimes she would take out the faded note Clara had written, "Be kind." Simple words, but in them lived the strength of everything she had learned. When asked about her years in the war, she never spoke of politics or battlefields. She only said, "I saw the enemy heal the wounded, and in that moment I understood who the real victors were." The world moved on, nations rebuilt, but somewhere in the echo of that quiet field hospital, the hum of generators and the steady rhythm of heartbeats carried a message that outlived the war itself. That true power does not lie in destruction, but in the will to save. The captured German nurses had witnessed the might of American medicine, but more than that, they had seen the triumph of humanity, and it changed them forever. One evening, she met a wounded American officer passing through. He had been part of the same medical unit that once held her captive. When he recognized her, he smiled. "You made it home," he said. Greta nodded. "Yes, and I think I found something to fight for." He asked, "What's that?" She looked around at the patients, children, widows, the broken and forgotten. "For this," she said simply, "for life itself." Years later, when Germany began to rebuild, the story of those captured German nurses faded into the quiet corners of history. No medals, no records, just memories of a time when compassion crossed enemy lines. Frau Rector became an instructor at a small nursing school, teaching not from textbooks, but from experience. She told her students, "Medicine is not for nations, it is for people." Ingrid lived out her days in silence, tending to the elderly in a ruined town that slowly healed. She never forgot the smell of antiseptic in that American tent, or the faces of the men who taught her what mercy meant. And Greta, she continued nursing until old age. Sometimes she would take out the faded note Clara had written, "Be kind." Simple words, but in them lived the strength of everything she had learned. When asked about her years in the war, she never spoke of politics or battlefields. She only said, "I saw the enemy heal the wounded, and in that moment I understood who the real victors were." The world moved on, nations rebuilt, but somewhere in the echo of that quiet field hospital, the hum of generators and the steady rhythm of heartbeats carried a message that outlived the war itself. That true power does not lie in destruction, but in the will to save. The captured German nurses had witnessed the might of American medicine, but more than that, they had seen the triumph of humanity, and it changed them forever.